A quiet morning on the lake turned into a day that the fisherman will remember for the rest of his life. He went out to check his nets, expecting to find only the usual catch, but instead of fish, he pulled up something that made his heart stop. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning air lay heavy over the water, still cool from the night but already carrying the promise of heat once the sun rose higher. A delicate mist stretched across the surface of the lake, shifting and curling like living breath, hiding and revealing the glimmering ripples beneath. From the reed beds at the shoreline came the faint rustle of insects, the slow croak of frogs, the wings of an early heron beating softly as it took to the sky. Everything was hushed, slowed down, as though the world itself hesitated to break the fragile silence of dawn. Into that silence came the creak of wood, the faint scrape of an oar, and the low sound of a man breathing steadily as he pushed his small boat away from the bank. Andre, the fisherman, knew these mornings better than any other man alive. For years his life had followed the rhythm of this lake, his days set by its moods, his fortune measured by what he could draw from its depths. He was a broad-shouldered man with dark skin weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused and scarred from rope, hooks, and nets. His boat was an old thing, patched and repaired many times, but it floated steady and true. To him, it was more than wood and nails. It was the vessel that carried him through solitude, through hunger and plenty, through every dawn when the others still slept. He rowed out into the mist, listening to the soft swish of water against the hull. It was a sound that steadied him, a sound that told him he was exactly where he belonged. He glanced behind him at the outline of the village, roofs barely visible through the fog, the faint plume of smoke from the first fires rising. He preferred this, being alone on the water before the chatter of neighbors, before questions and obligations. Out here, he was not only a fisherman, but a part of the lake itself, breathing with it, moving with it. The nets had been cast the night before, spread wide in the hope of catching enough fish to trade in the market and still have some left for his own table. He expected to find them heavy with perch or pike, maybe if luck was kinda catfish, though the larger ones had eluded him more often than not. He had pulled these ropes 1,000 times before and knew by touch alone what weight meant a full net, what weight meant weeds or branches, and what weight meant something worth hauling back with all his strength. As he leaned forward to begin the work, he felt again that quiet anticipation that never seemed to fade even after years of routine. Each morning was a chance at fortune, or at least at enough to get by. He braced his feet against the worn planks and pulled. At first, the rope came easily, damp and slick, sliding over the side of the boat as though it bore nothing more than the drag of water. Then, suddenly, resistance. His arms tightened, muscles straining as he heaved against a weight that clung stubbornly to the depths. His first thought was excitement, perhaps a heavy catch, a cluster of large fish thrashing against the cords. His pulse quickened as he leaned harder, hauling hand over hand, sweat rising on his brow despite the morning chill. But this weight was different. It did not shift with the jerks of fish caught in panic, nor sway with the tangled pull of weeds. It dragged back, slow and steady, as though the lake itself refused to release whatever was caught below. His breath grew louder in the silence. He told himself it must be a catfish, a monstrous one that had settled on the bottom and was fighting to stay hidden. The dream of every fisherman here was to pull such a creature from the lake, to hold proof of patience and strength in their hands. Andre's heart thudded harder at the thought. He paused a moment, gripping the rope, letting it tauten and quiver like a living thing between his hands. Then he pulled again, inch by inch, the boat rocking as the weight came closer to the surface. His shoulders ached, his palms burned, but he refused to let go. He had hauled tree trunks, tires, once even a rusted bicycle from these waters, yet there was something about this struggle that felt wholly different. It was not simply heavy. It was resistant, reluctant, as though the object below understood it was being dragged into the light and fought against it. The mist thinned slightly as the sun began to edge over the trees, turning the water to a dull silver. In that glow, he caught the first glimpse of something dark breaking the surface. Not the gleam of scales or the twitch of a fin, but a hard outline, rough with growth, coated in silt and shells. His breath caught. He tugged harder, leaning back with all his strength until the mass finally lurched free of the water and landed with a hollow thud in the bottom of the boat. The boat rocked violently, nearly tipping. Andre spread his arms for balance, the rope still clutched in his fists, eyes wide as he looked down at the thing he had dragged from the lake. For a moment, he could not even name it. The shape was rectangular, corners rounded by time, edges crusted with barnacles. The wood was blackened with age, bound in places by rusted strips of iron. Across the front was a thick lock, streaked with corrosion but unbroken. A smell of damp and decay rose from it, mingling with the faint scent of fish and wet rope. He bent closer, brushing away the slime and weeds with the back of his hand. Underneath, patterns emerged, faded carvings perhaps, or just the scars of water and time. The surface was cold to the touch, slick with centuries of silt. As the boat rocked, he heard it. A faint metallic clink from inside, something shifting and striking against itself. His pulse jumped. It was not empty. Whatever lay inside had weight and shape, and it called to him with every sound. For a long moment, he sat frozen, staring at the chest as though it might speak. He knew this was no ordinary catch. No fish, no branch, no scrap of metal thrown away by careless hands. This had been hidden, buried beneath the water for longer than he could guess. And now it lay before him, mute and waiting. The lake lapped softly against the boat, as if reminding him that the world around him had not changed. But Andre felt the change already, in his chest, in the way his breath came fast and shallow. He reached out again, pressing his fingers against the rusted lock, testing it. It held firm. The chest would not open easily. For now, it was a secret, sealed shut, offering only hints of what it carried. He sat back slowly, letting his eyes sweep across the empty expanse of water. The mist still hung, but thinner now, touched with gold. The world looked the same, yet he knew that by pulling this chest from the depths, he had crossed some unseen threshold. His day, his life even, would not be like the ones before. The boat drifted, rocking gently as though carrying both man and mystery. Andre's hands trembled on the oars as he prepared to turn back toward shore. His nets still lay in the water, forgotten. Fish or no fish. What he had caught today mattered far more than any meal or coin. He set his shoulders, fixed his eyes on the hazy outline of the village, and began to row, the chest heavy at his feet and the sound of its contents faintly echoing with each stroke. And so, as the first light of the sun broke fully across the horizon, the fisherman carried with him not just his morning's work, but the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the quiet lake. The chest lay at Andre's feet like a sleeping beast, silent except for the faint, uneven rattle that came whenever the boat shifted with the water. He had spent the entire row back to the shore glancing down at it, half in disbelief, half in unease, as though at any moment it might stir on its own and reveal its contents. The mist was lifting now, the sun painting the rippling surface in pale shades of gold and copper, and every flash of light seemed to reflect off the damp iron bands that held the chest together. He had pulled many strange things from this lake before, relics of careless people or storms that had swept away what they owned, but nothing that bore the same weight of time. Nothing that seemed to carry with it the whisper of lives long past. When the boat nudged against the bank, he sat still for a while, simply staring at the burden before him. The chest was large enough to fill nearly half the bottom of the boat, its soaked wood glistening, the crust of barnacles breaking off in flakes under the sun. He leaned forward cautiously and pressed his fingers against the iron lock again, just as he had on the water. It was solid, unyielding, rusted but strong. Whoever had locked this chest had not wanted it opened easily, and whoever had consigned it to the lake had wanted it hidden forever. That thought gnawed at him as he braced himself to lift it. The weight was punishing. He bent low, gripping the damp edges with both hands, his muscles straining as he tried to raise it from where it rested. The boat shifted beneath him, threatening to tip, but he adjusted, inch by inch dragging the chest toward the side. By the time he had managed to get it onto the dock, his breath was ragged, sweat dripping down his face despite the morning cool. He crouched there beside it, chest heaving, and looked down again. Now that it was out of the boat, the smell of waterlogged wood and decay was stronger, mingling with the faint tang of rust. He touched the surface again, and felt the ridges of old carvings beneath the slime, patterns too worn to decipher but not erased entirely. Curiosity pricked at him sharply. He shook the chest gently, hearing the dull clang of metal against metal, or perhaps against glass. Something was inside, something not softened by time. The sound made his heart lurch, a mixture of thrill and dread. He thought of forcing it open here on the dock, but the thought vanished as quickly as it came. The sun was rising higher, and soon others would be moving about the village, their eyes quick to notice anything unusual. This chest, heavy and strange as it was, would not stay secret long if he lingered here. With a grunt, he stooped again, heaving it onto his back in a clumsy, awkward embrace, and staggered toward his small house at the edge of the village. The path was short, but the chest made every step an ordeal. Villagers were beginning to stir, some emerging from their doorways, others starting their chores. He kept his eyes fixed forward, sweat stinging his brow, hoping that the weight and his determined pace would discourage questions. Yet he felt the prickle of glances upon him, heads turning, curiosity sparking already. By the time he reached his door, pushed it open with his shoulder, and dropped the chest inside with a dull thud that shook the floorboards, he knew the story would not stay with him alone for long. In the dimness of his single-room home, the chest seemed even older, even more foreign. He lit a small lamp, the flickering glow spilling across the rough grain of the wood, the rusted lock gleaming faintly. He crouched beside it, running his hands over the edges, tracing the grooves where the iron straps bit into the wood. Every mark told a tale of age, of years submerged in silence and darkness. And yet, inside, something had endured. That metallic rattle haunted him still, promising discovery, promising answers, perhaps even wealth beyond imagining. He tested the lock again, pulling at it, prodding the rust, but it held fast. It was not a thing to be broken by bare hands alone. He sat back on his heels and breathed slowly, staring at it, as though trying to draw its secrets into himself. Part of him urged action, to take hammer and chisel and tear it open, to see with his own eyes what lay inside, but another part warned caution. This chest had been sealed and hidden for a reason. Whatever it contained might not be meant for him, or even meant for the world at all. And still, his hands itched, his heart thumped, his mind refused rest. The lake had offered him this, and he could not turn away. Outside, he heard the faint voices of neighbors greeting the morning, children running along the dirt path, the clang of a pail against a well. Life was beginning as usual for everyone else, but for him, everything had shifted. He closed his door tightly, as though that flimsy barrier could shield him from the questions to come, from the inevitable intrusion of curiosity. He sat there in the half-light, watching the chest, hearing every creak of its damp wood as though it were alive. Hours passed in restless silence. He moved around his small home, trying to distract himself with chores, with mending nets or tending to tools, but his gaze always returned to the chest. The memory of its weight on his back, of its sound on the water, pressed in on him. He poured himself water, drank, stared again. He tried to rest, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it still, waiting, demanding. As afternoon bled into evening, he carried it to a corner, draping old nets and cloths over it as though to disguise its form. But even hidden, it seemed to loom. He felt it there in the dark, whispering its presence. At one point, in a moment of frustration, he kicked at it, only to draw back quickly when the sound inside rang out again, sharper this time, unmistakably metallic. That sound made his stomach twist, not with fear, but with a kind of feverish hunger. When night fell, he lit another lamp and sat beside it once more, fingertips brushing the cold lock, nails scraping against the iron. He thought of stories told in the village, of treasure chests buried long ago, of smugglers and soldiers who had hidden their wealth to keep it safe. He thought of merchants traveling with coins and jewels, of wars fought across these lands, of bodies cast into the water with their secrets. This chest might carry any of those tales. It might be the proof of a fortune lost, or the relic of a tragedy, or simply the forgotten possession of some nameless soul. But no matter the origin, it belonged now to him, drawn up by his hands, resting in his home. The question of its contents burned in his chest like fire. He told himself that tomorrow he would decide. Tomorrow he would find a way to break it open. For tonight he simply sat in the flickering light, the chest beside him, the sound of the lake faint through the window, and the weight of discovery pressing on his shoulders heavier than any catch of fish he had ever hauled. He did not notice the shadows moving outside, the curious figures that had passed his door more than once during the day, whispering to one another, wondering what the fisherman had pulled from the lake. He did not see the way the village had begun to turn its eyes toward his small house, curiosity spreading like smoke on the wind. For now there was only him and the chest, silent companions bound together by chance, by water, and by the promise of secrets locked away beneath rust and wood. Andre leaned back finally, exhaustion creeping over him, his lamp sputtering low. He lay down, still thinking of it, of the rattle inside, of the lock that held tight. He knew, even before his eyes closed, that his life had shifted forever. The lake had given him something he could not ignore, and whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with that chest still waiting, silent and sealed, but alive with all the questions of the past. By the time the next morning arrived, the village already hummed with whispers. Andre awoke restless, his sleep broken by uneasy dreams of locks and shadows, of heavy water dragging him down. When he stepped outside, the sun had just begun to climb, warm light spilling across the dirt paths between houses, and already he could feel the weight of eyes following him. His neighbors greeted him as they always did, but their glances lingered too long, sliding past his face to the closed door of his house, where the chest still waited under its covering of nets. There was a sharpness in the air that had not been there before, a curiosity too eager to hide itself. He carried water from the well and tried to ignore the murmurs. Children ran past him laughing, yet their laughter had a note of nervousness, and he heard one of them call out, asking if the fisherman had found treasure. The boy was quickly hushed by his mother, but not before the words reached other ears, and he caught the flicker of smiles among the men gathering near the square. Andre felt his stomach tighten. He had known the chest would draw attention. How could something dragged through the village on his shoulders not? But he had not expected the rumor to spread like fire through dry grass. As he went about his chores, he could not help overhearing fragments of speculation. Two old men argued by the smithy, one swearing the chest must be from the war, abandoned by soldiers fleeing across the countryside, while the other insisted it belonged to merchants who had once traveled the region with coins and jewels. Near the bakery, he heard a woman whisper to another that she had seen marks on the chest that looked like symbols, perhaps foreign, perhaps dangerous. Others claimed it might hold weapons, rusted but still deadly. The stories tangled and grew with every telling, each new voice adding its own layer until the truth was smothered beneath invention. By noon, Andre realized there would be no escaping it. Everywhere he went, people asked questions. Some tried kindness, offering food or small favors in exchange for a look at the chest. Others pressed more boldly, demanding to know what he had found, reminding him of laws that declared such discoveries belonged to all, not one man alone. A few were slyer still, hinting that it was dangerous to keep such a thing hidden, that accidents had a way of happening to those who hoarded what should be shared. Their words carried an edge that made him uneasy. Back inside his home, he sat staring at the chest, the cloth he had draped over it doing little to hide its presence. He felt as though he had brought a storm into his small world, a storm that now swirled beyond his walls and pressed at the seams. He tried to tell himself that the rumors would pass, that curiosity would fade as quickly as it had come, but deep down he knew better. The chest was too large, too strange, too full of promise. People would not forget. They would not stop wondering. And wonder could so easily become greed. As the days passed, the tension grew. More than once, he caught sight of men loitering outside his home, their eyes lingering on his door. When he went to the lake to tend his nets, he sometimes felt the weight of footsteps following him, though when he turned there was nothing but reeds and shadows. At night, he lay awake listening to the silence, broken by the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of settling wood, and imagined figures crouched outside his window, listening for the sound of him opening the chest. The village that had once been a place of routine and safety now felt like a cage of watching eyes. Andre struggled with his own thoughts as much as with those of others. The chest gnawed at him, its mystery burrowing into his mind until he could think of little else. He had dreamed of fortune before, in idle moments when the lake had been unkind, but never with such sharpness, never with the sense that it was within reach. Each time he shook the chest and heard the rattle inside, he imagined coins spilling, jewelry glittering, relics of value beyond measure. Yet another voice whispered that inside might be nothing at all, or worse, proof that the chest was not his to keep. Documents with names, claims, ownership, things that would strip it from his hands and leave him with nothing but the memory of what he had touched. The villagers' hunger for answers mirrored his own. He caught them in the act of watching him, trying to catch a glimpse through cracks in the shutters, lingering too long with offers of help he had never asked for. Some tried to draw him in to drink at the tavern, coaxing with laughter that turned sharp when he refused. Their insistence only hardened his resolve to keep the chest hidden, though each day the burden of secrecy grew heavier. He longed to open it, to end the torment of questions and guesses, but the lock held fast, and the thought of forcing it in plain sight made him hesitate. One evening, as the sky burned red and the lake mirrored the fire of the sunset, he stood at the water's edge with the chest heavy in his thoughts. He remembered the feel of it in his hands, the weight that had nearly toppled his boat, the strange inevitability of it rising from the depths. He had thought then only of what lay inside, but now he understood that it carried more than contents. It carried history, expectation, danger. By pulling it from the lake, he had not only changed his own life but stirred the entire village. Their lives, too, were now entangled with whatever secrets it held. He returned home in the dimming light and closed the door against the village, though the whispers still reached him through the walls. Sitting once more beside the chest, he laid his hand on the lock and closed his eyes. The murmurs of neighbors, the fragments of rumor, the edge of envy, he felt them all pressing against him, pushing him toward action. The chest had become more than a possession. It was a test, a challenge thrown into his path by fate or by the lake itself. He knew the time was coming when he could not keep it hidden, when whispers would turn into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. For now, though, he sat in silence with the chest beside him, the last light of day flickering against its rusted iron, and listened to the village hum with stories outside. He could not stop them. He could only endure, waiting, watching, feeling the pressure build as surely as the storm that gathered in unseen clouds above. The whispers of the village did not fade with time. They thickened, grew heavier, pressing against Andre's walls until it felt as though the whole world had turned its eyes upon him. Each day the glances became sharper, each greeting more loaded, and he began to sense that even the air carried suspicion. The chest, though hidden beneath nets and cloth, seemed to radiate its presence like a beacon. It was impossible to ignore. He carried it in his mind wherever he went, and the villagers carried it in theirs. At first, the unease crept in softly, like the mist that gathered each morning over the lake. Andre noticed shadows where there should have been none, the faint crunch of feet on gravel behind him when he walked alone, the way conversations faltered as he passed. Once, returning late from mending his nets, he thought he saw a figure slip into an alley, vanishing too quickly for him to recognize. Another night, he heard the distinct creak of his garden gate, though when he stepped outside with a lantern there was only silence and the whisper of the wind through the reeds. These things might have been tricks of his imagination, but he knew better. The chest had stirred something dangerous. The nights grew longer for him. Sleep, once deep and steady after days of labor, became broken and restless. He would lie in the dark, listening to the quiet of his small house, every creak of wood and sigh of the walls sharpened to a threat. Sometimes he rose and lit his lamp, staring at the cloth-draped chest as though expecting it to move. Other times he crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. More than once he caught sight of someone moving away from his door, slipping into the deeper shadows of the street. Whether it was one person or several, he could not tell. What he did know was that the chest had become more than a mystery to him alone. It was a magnet pulling greed and fear alike. By day, the villagers became bolder. A neighbor approached with a smile too practiced, offering to help him with his nets in exchange for a single look at what he had found. Another pressed him with stories of the law, insisting that such discoveries belonged to the state, not to a single man. Some of the younger men, eyes sharp and hungry, asked outright how much he would sell it for. Each encounter left Andre colder, more guarded. He had always lived simply, trusted his neighbors as they trusted him, but now he felt himself alone in a village he had once called home. The chest itself became a torment. Its presence filled his small room, its weight pressing on his mind until he could hardly breathe. He considered opening it again and again, trying tools, testing the lock with brute strength, but the iron remained firm. The harder he tried, the more it mocked him. Sometimes he thought he heard faint sounds from within, an echo of metal striking metal, a dull, shifting thud, as though whatever lay inside grew restless with his hesitation. Whether it was real or only his mind twisting under strain, he could not tell. He began to arm himself at night, keeping a knife within reach of his bed, sometimes even resting it across his chest as he drifted into uneasy slumber. He told himself it was foolish, that no one would be bold enough to break into his house. Yet the memory of those figures outside, of the silence after footsteps, gnawed at him. The chest had turned him into a man suspicious of everything, a man who trusted neither friend nor stranger. The lake, once his place of peace, became a place of refuge. Each morning he rode out before dawn, not only to check his nets but to escape the eyes and questions. Out there on the water he could breathe again, yet even then he found no true rest. He began to glance often over his shoulder, scanning the banks for figures watching from afar. Once he thought he saw a small group gathered on the ridge, standing still, but when he blinked they were gone. He told himself it was only the shape of trees, yet his heart beat faster all the same. Days passed in this half-life of fear and suspicion, and Andre felt himself shrinking under its weight. His meals lost their taste, his work grew sloppy, his thoughts circled endlessly around the chest. What had once been a fisherman's simple life was now a prison of secrecy and dread. He thought of leaving the chest by the lake, sinking it back into the water where it belonged, but the thought of letting go was unbearable. The lake had given him this, and though it poisoned his peace, he could not return it. The villagers' eyes turned sharper. At the tavern, voices lowered when he entered, yet the silence that followed was heavier than conversation. A group of men stopped talking altogether as he passed, their eyes flickering toward one another with unspoken understanding. Women, too, gave him looks, some curious, some pitying, others filled with quiet disapproval. The children, who once greeted him with laughter, now regarded him with hushed fascination, daring each other to run close to his door and then flee shrieking as though from a haunted place. He had become a man marked not by who he was, but by what he possessed. One evening, as the sun set blood-red over the lake, Andre sat on his doorstep watching the sky burn itself into ash. The chest was inside, silent and heavy, but he could feel it pressing even from here. He thought of his father and grandfather, men who had fished these waters all their lives without stirring such trouble. They had lived and died simply, their names remembered only by family, their lives defined by nets and patience. He had broken that chain with a single catch. For what? For the promise of treasure he had not even seen. For a weight that made enemies of friends. He shook his head and rose, retreating back inside, bolting the door behind him with more force than necessary. That night, the noises came again. He lay in bed, knife close, eyes fixed on the dark rafters above. At first, it was the faint creak of wood, as though someone leaned against the outer wall. Then came the soft scrape of something at the window. His breath caught, heart hammering, every muscle taut. The sound passed, leaving only silence, but he did not sleep. He lay awake until dawn, the knife warm from his grip, listening, waiting, certain that shadows moved just beyond the reach of his sight. When morning came, he rose with red eyes and trembling hands. He looked at the chest once more, at the rusted lock that defied him, and he knew something had to give. He could not endure these shadows forever. The chest had become the center of his life, and it drew darkness to him with every day it remained sealed. Whether it brought fortune or ruin, he knew he would have to face it soon. But the chest did not open, and the shadows did not vanish. They lingered still, patient and hungry, circling closer with each passing night. And Andre, caught between fear and desire, could only watch and wait, knowing that something inevitable loomed just beyond the edge of his quiet world. The days following those restless nights stretched into one another, each carrying the same oppressive weight of waiting. Andre lived like a man besieged, his world narrowed to the four walls of his home and the silent presence of the chest. He moved through his routines in a haze, his fishing done half-heartedly, his meals eaten without taste, his sleep fractured into short bursts haunted by sudden waking. The shadows around him had grown too real, the whispers too sharp. He felt the inevitable approaching, though he did not know what shape it would take. His knife remained close at all times, the wood of its handle worn smooth from the restless grip of his fingers. The village had shifted against him. He could feel it in the way men turned their shoulders when he passed, in the half-concealed glances traded behind his back. He heard the quiet laughter of younger men that carried an edge too pointed to be harmless. Women, once warm with greetings, now looked at him as though measuring something, calculating the weight of his silence. Even children, bold in their curiosity, had begun to dare each other to run close to his house at night and rap on the walls, their shrieks of fear and delight echoing into the darkness. The chest had turned him into a figure apart, both feared and envied, and he knew it would not be long before someone tried to take what he had found. That night came sooner than he expected. It was a moonless night, the sky thick with cloud, the air heavy and still. Andre lay on his bed with the knife beside him, his ears straining into the silence as they always did now. For a time there was nothing but the creak of the rafters and the faint sigh of the wind. Then, faintly, a sound reached him, the soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt outside his window. His breath stilled. He lay rigid, listening. Another sound followed, the hesitant groan of his gate opening slowly, then the muffled thud of it closing again. Someone was inside his yard. He rose silently, his bare feet moving across the worn floorboards, the knife firm in his hand. He stood still in the center of the room, straining to separate the sounds from the pounding of his heart. A shadow passed across the thin sliver of moonlight that slipped through the window. Then came a scrape against the wall, the brush of fabric against wood. He knew without doubt that they were at his house now, close enough to touch it. A sudden thump rattled the shutters. He flinched, his breath catching. Another followed, softer, then the unmistakable sound of careful hands testing the window frame. The hair on the back of his neck rose. Whoever it was moved with caution, not like children playing a prank, but like men intent on entering. The chest was no longer only his secret. It had become their prize. The silence stretched. He stood frozen, his knife slick with sweat in his palm, Then came the faintest squeal of wood as the door was tested, a subtle pressure against it. The bolt held, but the sound alone was enough to jolt him into action. He moved to the corner where the chest sat hidden beneath its cloth covering. He stood over it, the knife raised, his eyes fixed on the door. The sounds outside grew bolder now, the rustle of more than one man shifting. A low whisper, then the decisive creak as weight pressed harder against the door. The wood shuddered, the bolt groaned. Andre's breath quickened. He crouched lower, every muscle taut, ready to defend. The door rattled again, this time more violently, then stopped. Silence returned, deeper and heavier, broken only by his own pulse pounding in his ears. He wondered if they had given up, but then, in a sudden crash, the door burst inward, the bolt snapping with the force of it. Shadows spilled into the room, 3, maybe 4 figures, their outlines jagged in the dim light of his sputtering lamp. The first rushed forward, eyes glinting, hands outstretched for the chest. Andre lunged, his knife flashing, not to strike but to warn, to drive the man back. The intruder cursed and stumbled aside. Another came from the left, reaching for him. He swung the blade wildly, the point catching the edge of a sleeve. A cry followed, sharp and angry. The room filled with the scuffle of bodies, the scrape of boots, the panting breath of men desperate and unafraid of violence. Andre fought like a cornered animal, each movement born of survival rather than skill. He slashed, shoved, dodged, his knife an extension of his will to keep the chest his own. The men cursed, one calling for another to grab it quickly. He spun and saw a shadowed form bending over the chest, tugging at the cloth. With a guttural cry, Andre lunged, his shoulder striking the intruder hard. They both went sprawling, the chest rocking but remaining in place. The fight dragged on in frantic bursts, the room filling with chaos. Twice he felt hands grip him from behind, trying to wrench the knife away, but he twisted and broke free, desperation lending him strength. He did not think of winning, only of not losing. His home was small, the walls close, and every clash of bodies seemed to shake it to its foundations. He heard the crash of a stool, the shattering of a cup beneath stomping feet. The smell of sweat and fear thickened the air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack faltered. One man, clutching his arm where the blade had grazed him, muttered a curse and backed toward the door. Another spat in frustration, his eyes glittering with rage, but he too stepped back. The others followed, their retreat quick and ragged. In a heartbeat, they were gone, vanishing into the night as swiftly as they had come. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Andre's ragged breathing and the thundering of his heart. He stood unmoving for a long moment, knife still raised, eyes darting to the corners as though expecting them to return. Slowly, his muscles loosened, and he lowered the blade. His home lay in disarray, the door hanging crooked on its broken hinges, the floor scattered with fragments of wood and clay. The chest remained where it had been, the cloth torn back to reveal its damp, ancient surface, the lock glinting faintly in the lamplight. It looked unchanged, as though the chaos had never touched it, but Andre knew better. The fight had been for it, and it would not be the last. He dropped heavily to his knees beside the chest, pressing one hand against its cold surface. His breath came in shuddering gasps. The weight of the night pressed down on him harder than the weight of the chest itself. He had defended it for now, but he understood that this was only the beginning. The village had crossed a line. No longer was the chest simply an object of rumor and curiosity. Now it was a prize men would fight for, steal for, perhaps even kill for. When dawn crept pale and gray into the sky, Andre sat still in the wreckage of his home, his knife laid across his knees, the chest before him like an altar. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. He could not wait any longer. The night had shown him the truth. As long as the chest remained sealed, it would be a beacon drawing danger to him. He had no choice. Whatever lay inside, he had to face it, had to open it, had to bring its secret into the light before shadows consumed him entirely. He rose stiffly, exhaustion heavy in his limbs, and stared down at the lock one more time. The decision was made. The chest would be opened. The fight had carved away all hesitation, leaving only resolve. What awaited him within might change nothing, or it might change everything, but he could no longer endure the waiting. The time of secrets was ending. And so, as the first rays of morning spilled into his broken home, Andre prepared himself for the task ahead, his gaze fixed on the chest that had already transformed his life and would soon reveal the truth that had guarded through years of silence and shadow. The morning after the attack arrived with a hollow stillness, as though the entire world held its breath. Andre sat amidst the ruin of his small home, the chest before him, the door splintered, the signs of struggle scattered across the floor. His body ached, his hands bore fresh cuts, and his eyes stung from a night spent in ceaseless vigilance. But his thoughts were no longer clouded. The attempt to steal what he had pulled from the lake had burned away all hesitation. The chest could no longer remain a sealed mystery. It had become a beacon for greed, a lure for violence, and as long as it remained closed it would continue to poison his life. The only path left was to face it, to break the lock and discover what secrets lay hidden within. He spent the morning gathering what tools he could find. His home had never needed much beyond the implements of fishing, but in the corner he unearthed an old hammer, its handle worn smooth, and a chisel rusted from years of neglect. He found his small axe as well, the one he used to cut kindling. He laid them all beside the chest, staring at them as though trying to will them into strength. The lock glinted dully in the light of the lamp, mocking him with its persistence. He touched it again, feeling the cold iron against his skin, and told himself that today, no matter the cost, it would yield. The hours stretched. He worked first with the hammer and chisel, placing the blade against the seam of the lock and striking again and again. The blows rang through the small room, a harsh metallic clang that jarred his bones and echoed out into the street. With each strike, he half expected villagers to appear at his door, drawn by the noise, but no one came. Perhaps they listened from a distance, waiting, knowing what he attempted. Sweat poured down his face as he hammered, flecks of rust and splinters of metal flying with each strike, but the lock held stubbornly, its iron teeth clinging to the chest as though welded by time itself. When his arms trembled with exhaustion, he switched to the axe, driving its edge against the lock, prying at the corroded bands that bound the wood. Chips flew, the dull thunk of the blade filling the air, the chest shuddering with each blow. He cursed under his breath, striking harder, his muscles screaming in protest. Still, the chest resisted, as though it had grown out of the depths themselves, its secrets too entrenched to surrender. Yet Andre was no longer the hesitant man who had dragged it from the lake in wonder. He was a man hardened by fear, by sleepless nights, by the desperate fight to defend what was his. He pressed on, relentless, until at last the lock cracked with a jagged snap, the sound sharp as lightning in the silence. For a moment he froze, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The lock dangled from the chest, broken, defeated. The lid, swollen with damp and sealed by decades of weight, creaked faintly under his hand. He pressed harder, his shoulder straining, until the wood gave with a long groan, the hinges shrieking like wounded things as the chest slowly opened for the first time in years. The air that rushed out was thick and musty, the stench of age and decay, of paper long sealed in darkness. Andre recoiled, gagging, then leaned forward again, his eyes straining in the dim light to see what lay within. At first, he thought he had been deceived, that the chest held only ruined scraps, useless relics rotted by time. Bundles of paper lay piled together, edges blackened with mold, the ink smudged to near nothingness. But as he dug deeper, hands brushing aside the brittle sheaves, he saw more. Envelopes sealed with faded wax, maps drawn on parchment stiff with age, letters written in a hand elegant but fading. Among them lay a few objects, small and heavy, a tarnished compass, its glass cracked but its needle still twitching faintly, a pocket watch, frozen at an hour long past, and a thin chain with a locket, the metal dulled but intact. Andre's hands shook as he lifted the papers, trying to decipher the words. Though many were smudged beyond reading, some still held fragments of meaning. Names, places, dates. He saw references to routes across the land, trade agreements, signatures of men long gone. He realized with a shock that made his heart lurch that these were documents of history, the kind scholars treasured, the kind that told stories of wars and bargains, of families and fortunes lost. They were not coins, not jewels, not wealth in the sense he had dreamed of, but they carried a weight far greater. This was knowledge preserved, the kind of record that could change how people understood their own past. As he sifted through the contents, a strange calm fell over him. The fever of greed that had consumed him, the restless hunger to know, ebbed away, replaced by a deeper sense of awe. He thought of the men who had sealed this chest, of the hands that had pressed these letters into its belly before consigning it to the lake. They had meant for it to vanish, to keep its truth hidden. And yet the water had preserved it, waiting for him to bring it back. The thought filled him with both pride and dread. Why him? Why now? What was he to do with the weight of such a find? The afternoon light slanted through the broken door, gilding the chest and its contents in gold. Andre sat there motionless, the papers spread across his lap, the locket resting in his palm. He could hear the sounds of the village outside, voices, footsteps, laughter, but they seemed far away, muffled, as though he sat apart in another world. He understood that this moment marked a boundary. His life as a fisherman, simple and unnoticed, had ended. The lake had chosen him to be the keeper of this legacy, and nothing would return him to the way things were. But even as awe filled him, unease stirred again. If men had broken into his home for a chest unopened, what would they do now that it was revealed? The papers might mean nothing to them, but the idea of treasure once awakened would not die easily. He saw already the glint of suspicion in their eyes, the hunger that had driven them into his house at night. They would not believe him if he said there was no gold, no fortune. They would call him a liar, accuse him of hiding what he had found. The danger was not gone. It had only changed its shape. Andre gathered the papers carefully, placing them back inside, though the lock now lay useless on the floor. He draped the cloth over the chest once more, though the gesture felt hollow. The secret was no longer sealed. It breathed now in his hands, in his mind, and it would soon spread beyond his control. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes, the musty scent of old parchment clinging to his skin. The lake had given him this, and though he had dreamed of gold and jewels, it had given him something far heavier. He was no longer the man who sought only fish in the water's depths. He was the man who had pulled history itself from silence. And as the night descended, wrapping the village in darkness once more, Andre understood that his true struggle had only begun. The morning after he forced the chest open dawned cold and sharp, the air fresh with the scent of rain that had passed during the night. Andre sat at his small table, the chest still uncovered before him, its lock broken, its contents laid carefully in neat stacks. He had spent the hours after midnight sorting through the papers, drying them by the weak flame of a lamp, trying to preserve what age and water had spared. His body ached with weariness, but his mind was restless and alive. He felt as though he had crossed into a world he had not known existed, one where his hands no longer pulled only fish from the water, but the threads of history itself. The documents spoke in fragments, but even fragments had power. He found names that matched the old families spoken of in half-forgotten tales, dates that aligned with wars his grandfather had mentioned in quiet, reverent tones. He saw outlines of trade routes that had once crossed the region, mentions of gold shipments, letters sealed with authority. There were no coins here, no jewels glittering in the light, but these brittle pages carried the wealth of memory, the proof of how people had lived, fought, and lost. For scholars, for those who cared about the story of the land, this chest would be priceless. Yet Andre wondered if anyone in his village would understand. Already he sensed the danger that still hovered. If men had come willing to break into his home for the promise of treasure, they would not easily believe that the chest contained only papers and relics of little obvious worth. Suspicion would cling to him, greed would gnaw at them, and the truth would matter less than the story they had invented in their minds. The weight of secrecy had shifted, but it had not lifted. He knew he could not keep the chest hidden forever. If he tried, the shadows would only grow bolder, the attempts more violent. To survive, he would have to bring it into the open, to let others see what the lake had returned through him. The decision was not easy. He had lived his life in quiet solitude, never seeking attention, never craving the judgment of others. The thought of standing before them, of handing over what he had pulled from the depths, made his stomach twist. Yet he felt another weight pressing harder, the duty that had fallen upon him the moment he dragged that chest dripping into his boat. He had not asked for it, but it was his all the same. If he kept these things locked away, hidden from the world, their voices would remain silenced. If he revealed them, perhaps they could speak again. Days later, word spread quickly that Andre had taken the chest to the authorities in the nearest town. Some of the villagers followed him there, suspicious and watchful, convinced that he meant to profit secretly. But when the chest was opened in their presence, when officials and scholars unwrapped the fragile papers and leaned over them with widening eyes, murmuring with excitement and reverence, it became clear that what Andre had found was no simple fortune. The documents were examined, catalogued, treated with the careful respect of men who understood their worth. And slowly, even the villagers began to murmur with a different kind of awe. For the first time, Andre saw his discovery reflected in the faces of others. They spoke of museums, of archives, of preserving these relics for generations to come. They spoke of his name attached to the find, of how he had brought forth from silence something of value not measured in coin, but in meaning. Journalists came, their questions strange to him, their pens scratching furiously as they wrote his words. His photograph was taken, his weathered face and broad shoulders captured alongside the chest that had transformed him. He felt awkward under their gaze, uncertain of the attention, yet beneath the discomfort stirred a quiet pride. Back in the village, things did not change overnight. Some still muttered that he had hidden part of the treasure, that the papers were a trick, that he had pocketed the true wealth. But others began to treat him with a new respect, nodding to him in the street, offering him bread or a mug of beer in the tavern without charge. Children followed him with wide eyes, no longer to tease but to ask about the chest, to hear him tell how it had risen from the lake. Slowly, the bitterness in their whispers dulled, replaced by the reluctant recognition that one of their own had touched something greater than any of them had imagined. For Andre himself, the change was deeper and quieter. He still rose before dawn, still pushed his boat onto the water, still tended to his nets. The lake remained his companion, its mist curling around him each morning as it always had. But now, as he pulled the ropes and watched the water ripple, he felt something different in its silence. It was no longer simply the source of his living. It was the keeper of mysteries, the guardian of stories that lay hidden beneath its depths. And he, though only a fisherman, had been chosen once to uncover them. On some mornings, when the mist was thick and the air still, he sat in his boat without casting the nets, simply drifting, remembering the weight of the chest as it broke the surface, the shock that had coursed through him at the first sight of it. He thought of how he had fought to keep it, how he had trembled to open it, how it had changed everything. He thought, too, of how easily it might have been lost, had he not persisted, had he not dared to bring it home. Each ripple on the lake seemed to whisper of secrets still hidden, waiting, patient as time itself. He never spoke of treasure any more. When villagers pressed him with questions, he told them calmly what they already knew, that the chest had held history, not gold, and that the true wealth was in what the world could learn from it. Some scoffed, others shrugged, but a few listened with the kind of attention that planted seeds in their children. And in that, Andre found a peace he had not expected. He did not need riches, nor did he crave fame. The lake had given him something else, a role in the story of his people, a place in memory beyond the reach of nets and fish. On an evening when the sun set in streaks of crimson over the water, Andre sat on the shore, the old boat at his side, the air cool and still. He thought of the generations before him, men who had lived and died with little more than what their hands could haul from the depths. He thought of the future, of how scholars would pore over those brittle papers, piecing together lives long vanished, and how somewhere in their records his name would linger, not as a great man, but as the fisherman who caught more than fish. A man who had pulled from silence a story that would outlive him. As the last light faded and the water turned to shadow, Andre rose, his gaze fixed on the endless surface of the lake. He felt no fear now, no gnawing hunger, only a quiet gratitude. He knew the lake would keep its secrets, perhaps forever, but he also knew that once, for reasons he could not explain, it had chosen him to reveal one of them. That was enough. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Click that bell to be the first to see our upcoming videos. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share this video with your friends. You never know who will get hooked by the mystery too.